Adora's jaw clenched so hard the tendons in her neck strained like steel cables. With a harsh, ragged growl, she planted her palms into the frozen slush and forced her upper body off the ground. She was going to stand. She was going to reach her bow blade. She didn't get far. The movement pulled violently at the deep wound, and a fresh wave of agony hit her like a hammer blow. Her arms buckled, sending her back into the cold mud. A muffled scream escaped her gritted teeth, not of fear, but of raw, white-hot fury. Her chest heaved as she beat a bloody fist against the ice, furious at her own body, furious that a single, lazy flick of a wrist had brought her down like a novice. "Adora, stop! Don't move!" Rian panicked, grabbing her shoulders to keep her still. His hands were trembling, cold sweat slicking his brow despite the biting air. "Just stay down, please. Help is coming, I know it is. Just stay put." Above them, Hawthorne took a slow, unhurried step forward. The chaos of the battle around seemed 1,000 miles away, muffled by the heavy silence that surrounded him. He casually closed the distance between them, his dark eyes never leaving Rian. Slowly, Hawthorne reached out. He placed a heavy, broad hand onto Rian's shoulder. Rian flinched, expecting the agonizing, soul-crushing cold of Umbara, the frost that ate at a man's bones. Instead, a gentle wave of heat washed over him. It was a deep and radiant warmth, like sitting beside a crackling hearth after a long day in the snow, or the familiar steady clasp of a father's hand when the dark got too quiet. The suffocating weight in Rian's chest loosened. His frantic, shallow breaths slowed, and for a terrifying second the violent storm around them felt almost distant, almost safe. "Peace, my child," Hawthorne murmured, his thumb rubbing a slow, comforting arc across Rian's collarbone. "You have fought so hard. Let the burden drop." Rian's shoulders slumped. The relentless and terrifying noise of the mountain seemed to fade under the strange warmth of Hawthorne's hand. Every muscle in his body burned with exhaustion, which he found strange, and the sight of Adora bleeding in the mud threatened to snap the final thread of his sanity. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his eyes dropping to the blood-stained ground beneath his knees. "If I go with you," Rian whispered, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. He forced his head up, meeting Hawthorne's unblinking gaze with a look of hollow, desperate bargaining. "If I choose this, willingly, and abandon everything I've fought to regain, will you spare them? Will you let my friends, my folk, walk away with their lives?" Hawthorne didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, his dark eyes studying Rian with the quiet patience of an ocean watching a ship break upon the rocks. The silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute, broken only by Adora's shallow, agonizing breaths. Finally, Hawthorne's mouth curved into a soft, sorrowful smile. "Oh, Rian," he murmured, his grip on Rian's shoulder tightening just enough to feel like a gentle, reassuring embrace. "You ask for bargain after bargain, clinging to these fleeting shadows as if they were solid earth." He gestured vaguely toward the surrounding battlefield, where the blood flowed and the banners fell, then brought his dark eyes back to the boy before him. "Can you really not see it?" Hawthorne asked, his voice a low, melodious purr that vibrated deep within Rian's mind. "It is the past that holds you bound in chains, my child. It is your attachment to yesterday that you mourn, but it is tomorrow that asks only that you become." Adora's eyes locked onto Rian's, wide and desperate. Every line of her face begged him to refuse, to fight, to tear himself away from the monster standing over them. But as her mouth worked to form the words, her breath caught in her throat, a choked gasp the only sound she could force past her pale lips. The arrow or the sheer trauma was draining the life from her far too fast. Rian looked down at her, his expression softening into a tender and heartbreaking smile. "Everything will be okay," he whispered, trying to pour every ounce of comfort he had left into those 4 words. "I promise." Slowly, heavily, Rian began to push himself up from the ground. Hawthorne's hand remained resting on his shoulder, a steady, warm weight guiding him upward, coaxing him into surrender. As Rian straightened his knees, something shifted beneath his breastplate. A small pressure shifted from beneath, and a tiny object slipped out from under his armor, tumbling down to land softly in the slush at his feet. It was the little girl's charm. The small, simple token lay face up in the ice and blood. Its single blue feather stood out in sharp, striking contrast against the crimson stains spreading around Adora, bright as a patch of clear summer sky trapped in a realm of frost and blood. Rian froze mid-motion. "Please come home." The child's small, trembling voice echoed through his mind with the force of a thunderclap. He remembered the smudge of soot on her cheek, the fierce, innocent trust in her eyes as she pressed the crude charm into his hands before he marched into the valley. She hadn't asked him to save the world. She had simply believed, with absolute certainty, that he was the kind of man who came home. Hothan's comforting warmth suddenly felt sickly, suffocating, and terrifyingly fake. Rian stared down at the blue feather, his breath hitching in his chest, his boots locked to the cold earth as the memory pulled him back from the precipice. It all crashed over him at once, not as a burden, but as a roaring, incandescent fire. In the span of a single heartbeat, the fog in his mind shattered. He saw them all. He saw the weathered, hopeful faces of the people of Mount Calem, his people, who had watched their home crumble and yet still whispered his name in the dark, waiting for him to rise and lead them out of the shadow. He saw the bloodied valley below, churned beneath the boots of the men of Aldenor warriors who had crossed a vast ocean, leaving behind wives, children, and warm hearths to bleed in a foreign land for a war he had asked them to fight. He felt Varric's quiet, unshakable loyalty, the bloody snow clinging to Adora's hands, and the innocent, fierce trust of a child who believed he would come home. They weren't just memories. They weren't chains of the past holding him back, as the figure of Hothan claimed. They were his anchor. They were his vow. The hesitation vanished from Rian's eyes, replaced by a cold and searing clarity. His knees locked against the frozen earth. Slowly, deliberately, he looked down at the hand resting on his shoulder, the hand of the nightmare that had tried to tear his soul apart, and his chest rose with a deep, furious breath. Rising, he took a firm hold of his sword that lay a few paces away. Hothan felt the sudden tension snap through Rian's muscles. The illusory warmth vanished in an instant, replaced by the suffocating and bitter chill of the mountain air. Slowly, Hothan withdrew his hand, his eyes darkening as he read the fiery defiance blazing in the young prince's gaze. The quiet patience in the entity's face dissolved into a look of mild, lingering disappointment, the look of a master craftsman watching a delicate glass piece fail to take its mold. "A pity," Hothan murmured, taking a leisurely step back as the mountain wind whipped around his robes. "No matter, we can simply try again." Before Rian could even draw breath to respond, Hothan flicked his wrist. With the same violent, sickening speed that had taken Adora down, a thick plume of indigo mist erupted from Hothan's sleeve. It hissed like boiling oil as it shot across the icy ground, wrapping itself firmly around Rian's waist and chest. The magical tether snapped taut, violently dragging Rian across the frozen slush, pulling him several paces away from where Adora lay motionless. "No!" Rian snarled. He whipped his sword in a blinding arc. Steel bit into dark magic. Sparks of violet light exploded into the air as Rian slashed wildly at the writhing tendrils. Clang! Crack! On the third strike, the blade severed the indigo tether. The momentum sent Rian skidding across the ice, but he clamped his boots down, swiveling on his heel to face his tormentor head-on. His teeth were born, his eyes locked onto the dark figure of the entity ahead, weapon raised to strike. "You won't take me!" Rian roared. Hothan didn't even flinch. With another effortless wave of his hand, a fresh torrent of indigo mist swept out, wrapping around Rian's limbs like iron chains, dragging him forwards once more. Again, Rian fought. Again he swung his steel with frantic and furious power, hacking through the magical fog piece by piece, inching his way back toward the ground he refused to yield. Every muscle screamed, the cold mist biting into his skin, but Rian refused to break. He was a prince of Calem, and he would not give up. "Enough!" The voice that tore from Hothan's throat was no longer the soft and persuasive purr of a father. It rang out like two ancient, grinding stones, monstrous, layered, and entirely demonic, vibrating with the terrible force of Umbara itself. Hothan slammed his foot down onto the frozen earth. A localized violent shockwave exploded outward in a ring of crackling indigo force. The ground shuddered violently, fracturing the thick ice. The impact hit Rian like a physical battering ram, throwing him off his feet and jolting the sword clear out of his white-knuckled grip. The blade spun through the air, piercing the snow point first several meters behind him, humming with the shock of the blow. Beyond their clearing, the outer ring of fighting men, both Nostrudor soldiers and Inimicus warriors, stumbled and skittered across the ice as the ground quaked beneath them, shields clattered, and men swore, yet none of them turned to look. It was as if the immediate space surrounding Rian, Adora, and Hothan had been wrapped in a shroud of complete imperceptibility. To the screaming, bloody battlefield, their tragic tableau was entirely invisible, a forgotten pocket of reality where an ancient enemy made one final attempt to break a prince. Rian hit the ground hard, gasping for air as the dark mist gathered around him once more, pinning his arms to his chest. Hothan stood over him, towering against the gray sky, his dark eyes burning with terrifying, absolute fury. Hothan lifted his hand, the indigo mist around Rian constricting like an iron vice. But when he spoke, the voice that echoed through the unnatural stillness was no longer Hothan's, nor was it the booming roar of Umbara. It was a voice Rian knew with a gut-wrenching clarity, cold, calculating, unforgiving. It was the voice of Zarek. "Did I not tell you before, boy?" Zarek's voice rasped from Hothan's throat, smooth and terrifyingly calm. Hothan's head tilted slightly, his dark, unnatural eyes shifting, locking onto the pale and bleeding form of Adora lying prone in the slush. "I told you in the false city," the voice continued, smooth as liquid ice, "that inconsistencies in the script would be erased." A heavy, suffocating silence fell as the words settled between them. Hothan slowly dragged his gaze away from the dying archer and brought it back to Rian, who was struggling desperately against the misty chains pinning his arms. "And you, Rian," Zarek's voice purred through Hothan's lips, laced with a cruel, monstrous triumph. "You will be the ultimate stroke of the pen to wipe out the folk of Aethelgard." The indigo mist crept up Rian's neck, slick and suffocating, clinging to his jaw and mouth. It pressed into his throat, cutting off his air until his lungs burned for oxygen and every attempt to speak died in his chest. Above him, Hothan let out a low, guttural laugh, savoring the boy's total paralysis. Then, Hothan's eyes flashed a violent, blinding purple. The laughter died in his throat. His head snapped toward the boundary of the pocket realm, where the unnatural fog of the battlefield was actively parting like water before a bow. Adora, her cheek pressed against the frozen slush, could barely keep her eyes open. With the last of her failing strength, she managed to turn her head toward the rustling ice behind her. Through the swirling veil of gray mist, a solitary figure walked into the clearing. He moved with a quiet, unhurried grace that defied the carnage around them. "The Min Elderith clan does not bow to the darkness of the north," a voice bellowed, rich, resonant, and carrying the ancient weight of living mountain stone. "And it never will." Hothan recoiled. His grip on the indigo mist shattered, almost unwillingly, as if the force entering the clearing was tearing the dark magic from his fingers. The misty chains dissolved into harmless vapor. Rian collapsed onto the ice, drawing in a sharp, agonized gasp of cold air. He pushed himself up on shaking hands and looked up through his tangled hair. Standing tall directly behind the prone Adora was Hokar. The old elf looked magnificent, radiant and utterly untamed by the mountain wind. Rian's heart slammed against his ribs, a surge of pure, overwhelming relief washing over him. He had never been more pleased to see a living soul in his entire life. "Grandfather," Rian choked out, his voice raw. Hokar didn't speak. His piercing eyes flicked briefly to Rian with a brief, fierce warmth before dropping to the bleeding archer at his feet. Without a word, the elder knelt beside Adora. His weathered hand reached down, brushing past the blood-soaked fabric to firmly grasp the arrow shaft right near the base of the stomach wound. In his other hand, the staff flared. The sapphire crystal at its peak emitted a strange, hummed chord, a deep and resonant sound that felt less like audio and more like the pulse of the earth itself, ancient, magical, and terrifyingly powerful. A blinding wave of azure light erupted from the staff, washing across the snow. Hothan hissed, taking a sharp pace backwards and raising an arm to shield his dark eyes from the searing purity of the flash. As the light faded, Rian scrambled forward and Adora gasped, her hands flying to her own stomach. Where the lethal arrow had been buried inches deep, there was now no blood, no gaping hole, no ruined flesh. There was only a clean tear in the leather fabric of her tunic and smooth, pale skin underneath, entirely unblemished. Hokar slowly stood back up. In his right hand, held high against the gray sky, was the arrow, completely intact, pulled from her body without leaving a single trace of dark magic behind. Hothen smoothed down the dark fabric of his robes, standing tall and proud before the ancient entity. A twisted, knowing smile cut across his face. "Well, hello, father," Hothen purred, his voice dripping with smooth and venomous familiarity. "It must be quite a shock to see this face again, after so long a time." Hokar didn't give him the satisfaction of a verbal response. His jaw set firm, and his expression hardened into a subtle, dangerous sneer, eyes burning with an ancient contempt that spoke louder than any shout. Hothen's gaze flicked down toward the ground, taking in Rian on his knees and Adora gasping for air. He clicked his tongue softly. "Your grandson. My son," Hothen mused, tilting his head with mock sadness. "It seems he has become quite a liability. A disappointment, if you would." At the word son, the sapphire crystal atop Hokar's staff flared with a sharp, blinding pulse of azure light. The hum of the stone vibrated through the freezing air, humming like a weapon drawn from its scabbard. Hothen's eyes locked onto the brilliant light. The arrogant smirk faded from his lips, replaced by a sudden and intense fascination. A suffocating silence settled over the clearing as he stared at the pulsing blue stone, the light reflecting deep within his dark, unnatural pupils. He stayed like that for several seconds, completely still. "So," Hothen whispered, the tone of his voice shifting, turning inward. "It is the Min Eldereths that possess the second stone. How very interesting." His eyes glazed over slightly, his focus drifting away from the battlefield entirely. A quiet darkness settled over his features, as if he were digging deep into a long-forgotten vault of his mind, reaching back through centuries of shadows, searching for the memory of the first stone, and the ruin that followed its breaking. Hokar took a single step forward. He stood undaunted by the cruel mind games of the entity before him, ignoring every poisonous word spoken through the mouth of his son. "You will remove this stolen face at once!" Hokar's voice boomed across the silent pocket of ice, ringing with absolute authority. "Umbara, scourge of the frozen north!" With a crack like thunder, the elder slammed the butt of his staff into the frozen earth. The sapphire crystal lit up in a blinding pulse of azure light. For a breathless second, the bitter mountain wind died, and everything stood terrifyingly still. Adora was the first to notice the shift. Her eyes widened in quiet horror, followed instantly by Rian's. Hothen's face began to melt. No, not melt, it was sliding. The skin, the familiar jawline, the robes, and the armor suddenly loosened, slipping off the underlying frame, as if whatever held the illusion together had been violently severed. It was a ghastly, sickening sight for Rian. To watch the face of his father warp, twist, and slough away like dying wax turned his stomach to lead. As the mortal husk dissolved into nothingness, the true terror underneath revealed itself. Standing before them, towering above the elves with an ancient, suffocating malice, was the true form of the puppet master of the northern lands, Umbara. It possessed no physical flesh. Instead, it took the shape of a broad-shouldered, towering silhouette of a man composed entirely of writhing, dense indigo and violet mist. The shadows churned violently within its silhouette, crackling with dark energy. But through the shifting, ethereal storm of its body, one feature burned with terrifying clarity. 2 eyes. Glowing with a brilliant, predatory violet light, those eyes stared down at them with a pure and unadulterated evil. It was a gaze that set Rian's teeth violently on edge. His instincts told him to run and to not look back. A sudden, icy dagger of fear struck straight into Adora's chest. She suddenly forgot how to breathe as she stared deep into the almost mesmerizing gaze. Hokar stepped forward, placing himself between Umbara and the 2 young elves. Crouching together in the bloody slush, Rian supported Adora as her gaze frantically darted across the red-stained ice, searching for her fallen bowblade. Yet, the sheer pressure emanating from the shifting entity before them rooted her in place. She knew, with a warrior's instinct, that breaking cover right now to reach for steel would be fatal. Rian stared up at the towering silhouette of violet and indigo smoke, his voice barely a breath. "Is this it? Is this the evil that was in my thoughts? The thing that wanted me to—" "Yes." Adora cut him off sharply, her voice quiet but iron-hard. She didn't take her eyes off those glowing violet orbits. "That's it." From deep within the shifting spectral mass of Umbara came a sound, a low, rumbling resonance that vibrated in the soles of their boots. It was impossible to tell if it was a mocking laugh or a guttural growl of hatred. Without a mouth or throat to shape it, the noise simply echoed out from the void itself. Beyond the invisible boundary of their clearing, the wider battle was finally reaching its violent crescendo. Beyond the clearing, the battle shifted. Giants and Inimicus fell one by one beneath the combined fury of elves and men. The roar of combat no longer sounded desperate. It sounded victorious. Through sheer grit and heavy sacrifice, the allied forces of men and elves were prevailing. Crimson snow was littered with the fallen, but all except one of the hulking beasts now lay dead, their massive carcasses steaming in the freezing air. As the chaotic roar of the main clash began to die down, the veil concealing the confrontation began to thin. A few surrounding soldiers, weathered men of Nostrudor and silver-armored elves, turned their heads. Bloodied and breathless, their eyes locked onto the terrifying scene unfolding at the center of the field, their prince, their elder, and the ancient nightmare of the north made manifest. The sapphire crystal atop Hokar's staff was no longer emitting a calm and steady radiance. It was pulsing erratically, wildly flickering violently between its natural, pure azure light and a sickly, intrusive shade of indigo. The gem seemed to churn from within, no longer a serene relic, but a raging storm imprisoned within crystal. Hokar's shoulders suddenly dropped. The proud posture he had maintained bled away in an instant. His hands, gnarled, ancient, and pale, clutched the staff with a desperate grip, as if the weapon itself had suddenly become a crushing weight pulling him toward the icy earth. "Grandfather!" Rian gasped. Seeing the sudden shift in the old man's posture, Rian scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agony in his own limbs as he surged forward to support him. From within the towering form of Umbara, a sound echoed out. When it spoke, it was not a whisper or a roar, but an agonizing resonance that shattered the silence of the valley, grating against the eardrums of every surviving soldier on the field. "You see the truth of it now, old man," Umbara rasped, the violet light in its eyes flaring with monstrous delight. "The stone draws its strength from the soul of the one who wields it, and your spirit was already frail, already fading." The words hit Rian harder than any physical blow. He froze, his eyes wide as he looked from the flickering stone down to the heavy, shallow rise and fall of Hokar's chest. The terrible reality struck him with an unnerving clarity. The staff of his grandfather wasn't a magic source with infinite power. It was a conduit, one that drew upon the very soul of its bearer. To push back an entity of darkness, Hokar wasn't just casting a spell. He was burning his own remaining life, thread by thread, second by second. If this battle continued, Hokar wouldn't just lose. He was going to die right here in the snow. Rian slammed his boot into the ice and reached Hokar's side. He threw his left arm across his grandfather's chest, taking the old man's staggering weight to keep him upright, and planted his right hand firmly onto the shaft of the staff. The oak felt surprisingly warm under his fingers, not the sickly false heat of Hothen, but a living pulse, like the heartwood of an ancient forest. The moment Rian's palm closed around the wood, the staff reacted. Thump! A sound like the heartbeat of the mountain echoed through the valley. The chaotic and violet turbulence trapped inside the crystal was instantly vaporized, wiped away by a blinding eruption of deep, oceanic blue. The pure light flared outward in a radiant shockwave, cutting through the shadows like a blade. Umbara recoiled. The brilliant azure glare struck the entity's ethereal form like a gale-force mountain wind, tearing at the indigo mist and threatening to scatter its shadowy mass into the sky. A high-pitched screech tore from the entity, grating violently against the skulls of every soldier on the battlefield. Then, with a sudden, horrifying surge of malice, Umbara fought back. The shadowy brute planted its spectral form, expanding outward until it towered even higher over the clearing, blotting out the gray sky above. The violent countersurge of dark power struck the battlefield itself, shattering the ice underfoot and causing the very bedrock of Calem to tremble violently beneath their boots. "Grandfather, are you okay?" Rian breathed, his arm locked around the old man, feeling the violent tremors running through Hokar's body. Hokar leaned heavily into his grandson, his chest heaving as he drew in ragged, freezing gasps of air. Slowly, weary eyes lifted to meet Rian's. "Yes," Hokar rasped, the word barely a whisper above the howling wind. "Yes, my child, but there is something I must do, something that must be finished, just as our ancestors did an age ago." Rian's eyes darted up to the sapphire crystal, watching the deep blue light pulse in rhythm with his grandfather's fading heartbeat. Beside them, ice crunched underfoot. Adora had forced herself up, her face pale, but her expression grimly set as she moved into position directly behind Hokar. There was no hesitation in her stance. She knew. She understood what Hokar was preparing to attempt, the absolute, irreversible sacrifice it demanded. And from the terrible shadow above them, it was clear Umbara knew too. The towering figure of indigo mist took a long, wispy step forward. A heartbeat later, the dense core of Umbara's form lurched after it, stretching unnaturally before snapping back into place. "You cannot do it, can you?" Umbara's voice rattled the ice beneath their feet, dripping with a mixture of dark disbelief and rising panic. "You know what it means, if you break the final stone." Hokar did not answer immediately. Slowly, the elder turned his head, looking past the shimmering barrier toward the jagged peaks of the mountain behind them, toward the kingdom, the hearths, and the people he had spent a lifetime protecting and guiding through the dark. Then he turned back to Rian. Rian stood up tall beside him, his chin raised and his shoulders set. In the dim, magical glare of the staff, the sight of the boy struck Hokar like a memory long forgotten. Rian no longer looked like a terrified prince lost in the snow. Standing there, fierce and resolute, he looked like the noble vision of his father, Hothan, before shadow ever found his heart. Across the expanse, the harsh and resonant blast of a war horn split the freezing air, once, twice, a rhythmic call that echoed off the jagged granite of Calem's peaks. It was Tormund's horn. Recognizing the tactical signal, the commanders of Nostrador and the Elven vanguard barked out unified orders. The ranks of men and elves, spent, bleeding, and surrounded by the wreckage of a brutal victory, began a fast-paced retreat. They pulled back, swinging around the perimeter of the clearing to reform their lines firmly behind where Hokar, Rian, and Adora stood ground against the dark entity. They left the center of the valley open, yielding the stage to the ancient power gathering at its heart. Opposite them, the remaining horde of the north coalesced around their master. The surviving beast, the towering, hulking horror dripping with dark blood, staggered out of the crimson fog to form behind Umbara's back. Beside them, the monstrous Inimicus of the Umbral lands fell into line, their hollow, glowing eyes locked onto the towering brute of indigo mist. They stood utterly motionless, devoid of independent thought, like statues carved from shadow and ice. They did not attack. They did not roar. They simply waited in terrifying silence for a single command from their creator, the entity that held the leash on every nightmare in the north. "Rian, get back here!" Adora's voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and urgent. She reached out toward him from behind Hokar, her hand outstretched. "Rian, come back to my side now." "No!" Rian shouted back, his voice raw with defiance as he planted his boots deeper into the frozen earth. His grip on his grandfather's chest and the warm oak of the staff tightened. "I'm not leaving him. He's all I have left." He looked frantically between Hokar's pale, sweat-sheened face and the wildly pulsing sapphire crystal above them. "What happens if the stone breaks? Grandfather, tell me, what does it do?" Neither Hokar nor Adora answered him. The silence between them was heavier than the mountain air, filled only with the ragged rasp of the elder's breath. Then, from the writhing silhouette of Umbara came that same low, guttural laugh, a sound like grinding stone and shattering ice that vibrated straight through Rian's skull. "Your lands broke before." Umbara's voice echoed, mocking and triumphant as the indigo mists swirled violently around its towering form. "The first stone of your foolish forebears cracked the very earth you stand upon, fracturing Aethelgard in two. Do you truly think your fragile world can survive a second break?" Rian's mind raced, the entity's words striking a sudden and terrifying chord deep within his memory. The watery gorge. He remembered the vast, unnatural abyss off the mountain's western flank, a terrifying chasm hundreds, if not thousands of feet deep, its sheer obsidian cliffs looking less like the work of nature and more like a jagged tear struck into the crust of the world by something extremely powerful. A cold sweat broke out across Rian's neck as the horrifying truth settled in. The gorge wasn't a natural canyon. It was the crater left behind the last time a stone of Aethelgard had been shattered, and his grandfather was about to do it again. Hokar's breathing slowed. The weariness drained from his shoulders, replaced by a terrifying resolve. He let go of his grandson's arm. With sudden, violent speed, the elder reached up with his free hand and clamped his fingers directly around the pulsing sapphire crystal at the peak of the staff. He didn't try to harness its power. He didn't try to aim it. He just twisted, hard. Crack! The sound was sharp and explosive. The crystal tore free from its ancient wooden housing, and the great staff instantly splintered, the dead wood shattering into a dozen useless pieces that clattered onto the frozen ground. In the palm of Hokar's hand rested the pure, unbridled heart of the crystal. It looked like he was holding a living, brilliant blue flame. It flared with a dazzling and blinding intensity, throwing violent shadows across the snow, and it was burning him alive. The brilliant light sizzled and popped against Hokar's skin. Smoke began to curl from between his fingers, his hand trembling violently from the sheer, agonizing heat of the raw power, but his grip never faltered. "Grandfather, no!" Rian surged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the crystal, to tear it from the old man's hand before it incinerated him completely. He didn't make it. Adora lunged, moving with a desperate speed. She grabbed Rian's wrist mid-air, yanking his hand back violently. Using the momentum, she threw her entire body weight against his, tackling him backwards and wrapping both her arms tightly around his chest, dragging him down into the slush and pinning him there. "Let me go! Let me go!" Rian screamed, thrashing wildly against her grip. Tears streamed down his face, freezing against his cheeks as he watched his grandfather walk away from them. He sobbed, a raw, ragged sound of total despair, tearing his voice raw as he screamed into the roaring wind. Adora buried her face against his shoulder and held him with every ounce of strength she had left as Hokar strode forward, alone, into the suffocating darkness of Umbara. The horde surrounding the dark god broke into instant chaotic panic. The lesser beasts snapped their jaws and shuffled backwards in confusion, their primitive minds overwhelmed by the terrifying pressure radiating from the burning stone. The hulking brute raised its massive arms to ward off the blinding light, taking slow, trembling steps back into the shadows of the valley. Yet Umbara did not flinch. The towering figure of indigo mist stood its ground, its spectral chest expanding as it opened its arms wide, almost welcoming the dying elder, inviting the absolute destruction striding toward it. A low, terrible laugh vibrated through the earth, thick with horrific realization. "This is what I had written from the beginning." Umbara's voice echoed, resounding with a dark, triumphant satisfaction that sent a chill through the blood of every soldier watching from afar. It was supposed to be his young, foolish will holding that power, to do this exact thing. The violet eyes flared into blinding suns of pure hatred. "Break it, old man!" the entity sneered, its shifting mist writhing in victory. "Break the last wellspring of your ancestors. Once it shatters, I will feast upon the broken souls of your race for an eternity. There will be no rekindling the spirit of the elves, no light left to spark a morning." It stood tall, reveling in the moment. Every nightmare, every war, every lie, and every drop of blood spilt in the frozen north, all of it had been meticulously manipulated, spun like a spider's web for this precise, agonizing instant. Umbara believed it had already won. Hokar stood firm, his feet planted like the roots of an ancient mountain. Though the searing power of the stone sizzled against his flesh, the agonizing sound of burning skin cutting through the freezing air, the elder did not falter. Within his beating heart rested the living memory, the grief, and the unbreakable resolve of his entire race. Raising his head, Hokar fixed his burning gaze on the towering nightmare before him. His voice, clear and booming, cut straight through the chaotic roars of the retreating beasts and the crackle of the azure flame. "You are mistaken, fiend of darkness," Hokar proclaimed, his words carrying a terrifying and ancient weight. "You were driven back before, yes, but you were not fully known to our ancestors at the time. You forget the true reason we broke the first stone." Umbara's triumphant laughter died. The writhing indigo mists of its body froze mid-swirl. For the first time, the burning violet eyes flickered with a shadow of hesitation. It offered no reply. Hokar took another agonizing step forward, the crystal blazing so brightly in his hand that it cast long dancing shadows clear across the ground. "It was never to surrender to the void," Hokar roared. "Nor was it born of despair. Nor was it born of despair. It was our needless slaughter with the men of Nostrudor." The first stone was not broken to destroy men. It was broken to save them. It ended a war. It did not begin another. Far back along the reformatted defensive lines, Tormund sat atop his war horse. At the mention of Nostrudor, the old general's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened as an ancient, half-forgotten song, a dark lineage tale passed down by the hearths of his forebears from a long time ago, suddenly surged back into his mind. Tormund slammed his spurs into his horse's flanks. The beast let out a loud, frost-laced snort and surged forward, breaking from the safety of the ranks. The song wasn't a legend. It was a memory. The realization washed over Rian like a wave of snow, cold and sickening. The watery gorge. The ancient war between men and elves. The first shattered stone wasn't a tragic accident born of despair. It was a desperate last resort. It had been a weapon. An earth-shattering act of absolute destruction that had rewritten the map of Aethelgard. But the weight of history couldn't anchor itself in Rian's mind. The political lore, the ancient sins of his ancestors, the sudden frantic movement of Tormund's horse, all of it blurred into background noise. He couldn't care about the past. He couldn't care about the world. All he could focus on was his grandfather. Rian's eyes were pinned on Hokar's back. He watched the agonizing, subtle trembling in the old man's shoulders, smelled the horrifying scent of burning skin, and saw the blinding, white-hot light leaking between Hokar's white-knuckled fingers. Adora's arms were locked like iron bands around Rian's chest, pinning him to the icy slush, but he barely felt her weight. "Grandfather?" Rian whimpered out, his throat raw and bleeding from screaming. Tears hot enough to scald his cheeks spilt into the snow. "Please, don't—" Hokar paused. Slowly, with an aching, deliberate motion, the elder turned his head back over his shoulder to look at Rian one last time. The brilliant, blinding light of the stone illuminated the deep lines carved into Hokar's face, but the terrible pain racking his body seemed to vanish from his features. In its place was a radiant calm. And then Hokar smiled. It was a soft, gentle expression, devoid of fear, full of an unshakable love and pride for the boy. The memory of a smile reached into Rian's mind, cutting straight through his grief like a blade. Garth. Rian saw his friend's face as if he were standing there beside them, the blood on his cheek, the cold, and that same quiet, peaceful smile Garth had given him right before his breath left his body. Garth had smiled as he neared death, knowing he had protected what mattered most. And now Hokar was giving him that same gift. "Grandfather!" Rian gasped, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. Hokar's smile broadened just slightly, his eyes shining with tears that reflected the deep azure flame in his palm. He gave Rian a single, subtle nod, a silent passing of the torch, a final goodbye. A sudden, cold wave of terror struck the towering nightmare. For all its ancient intellect, for all its centuries of scheming and manipulation, Umbara had miscalculated. The elder wasn't acting out of desperate defeat. Hokar knew a secret buried deeper than the foundation of the northern ice, a secret the entity itself had never foreseen. Fear, hot and frantic, surged through the writhing indigo mist. "No!" Umbara screeched, the sound no longer triumphant but frantic and shrill. Driven by sheer panic, the entity lunged forward. Whether it intended to swallow the old man whole, tear the gem from his flesh, or simply crush him into the ice, it did not know. It only knew it had to stop him. The massive husk of shadow collapsed the distance between them in a heartbeat, dark tendrils reaching out like talons to envelope the elder. Hokar didn't flinch. Just as the suffocating wave of indigo fog reached his face, Hokar spun with lightning speed. With a roar that echoed off the mountain peaks, he thrust his burning, bloodied fist straight skyward, driving the unsheathed crystal into the air like a beacon. Boom! A blinding dome of raw, oceanic light exploded outward in a localized shockwave. The shockwave slammed directly into Umbara's form. The shadowy figure let out an agonizing, ear-splitting shriek as its misty form was violently repelled, hurled backwards through the freezing air like dust before a gale. The entity tumbled through the sky, crashing hard into the dirt and ice, right back among the confused, terrified ranks of its own inimical creations. Hokar stepped forward once more, putting even greater distance between himself and his grandson. The wind died down around him, swallowed whole by the tremendous pressure building in his hand. With a slow, deliberate movement, he lifted the blazing sapphire crystal high above his head. Then Hokar began to sing. The words were in an ancient, high elvish tongue, a melodic and heartbreaking song that resonated not through the air but directly through the bones of everyone who heard it. As his voice rose, the crystal reacted, pulsing in perfect harmony with the melody. The light shifted from a harsh sizzle into a blinding, magnificent aura of pure azure radiance that expanded outward in shimmering waves. Umbara thrashed in the snow, frantically struggling to pull its scattered, shadowy form back together. The surrounding Inimicus, completely overwhelmed by the sacred resonance, broke ranks entirely and began to scatter in wild, shrieking panic. Hokar reached the crescendo of his song, and with a swift, devastating motion, he drove his arm down, slamming the crystal directly into the frozen earth. A breathtakingly long silence instantly fell across the entire battlefield. The wind stopped. The roars ceased. Even the air itself felt frozen, suspended in a suffocating stillness. Adora, frozen in absolute awe, unconsciously loosened her grip. Rian slipped from her arms, falling forward onto his knees in the slush, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at his grandfather's motionless back. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, it seemed as if nothing had happened. Then came the crack. It was an audible, deep earth fracture, a sound like the spine of the world breaking. From the point where the crystal was embedded in the dirt, the ground began to splinter outward, tearing open from east to west in both directions. It wasn't a simple tremor. It was as if an invisible titan force beneath the crust was violently gripping the earth and pulling it apart. From the depths of the tear, the crystal's brilliant interior began to pour out, oozing into the expanding fissures like glowing blue wax pouring from a candle. Then came the spark. The liquid light ignited into a roaring, skyward pillar of blazing blue fire. The heat was instantaneous and absolute. The blinding wall of flame evaporated every trace of the surrounding northern fog and mists in a fraction of a second. The blue blaze crawled along the deep cracks fracturing the earth. To the north, where Umbara and his terrified creations lay, the ground began to grind, shatter, and collapse into a widening abyss. As the wildfire of pure spirit touched the crumbling rock, it ignited the enemy. Shadows, flesh, and dark magic alike, burning through the horde like a firestorm in a dry forest. On Rian and Adora's side of the rift, the world became a blinding, deafening void. They couldn't see the horde dying. They couldn't see Umbara's final thrashing. All that existed was the towering skyward curtain of blue fire and the catastrophic earthquake violently rolling beneath their feet. Rian wiped a mix of soot and icy slush from his eyes, blinking furiously against the burning ash, but the air above the abyss was a wall of churning black smoke and brilliant blue ember fog. Adora pulled herself up beside him, squinting through the hazy thermal waves rising off the bedrock, her breathing ragged as she desperately searched the edge for any sign of Hokar's mantle in the gloom. They saw nothing. Only the deep, hollow draft of the newly torn gorge sighing up from the depths. Behind them, the battlefield was filled with terror and absolute confusion. Every soldier, human and elf alike, lay flattened against the earth, their armor clattering as they pressed themselves into the dirt to survive the shockwave. Shields lay abandoned in the slush. Horses, including Tormund's warhorse, were down on their flanks or rearing wildly, terrified by the supernatural tremor that had just broken the world. Further back along the ridge, the refugees of Mount Calem were in sheer panic. Mothers and fathers wrapped their bodies over their children, clutching them to their chests in the freezing dirt, burying small faces into wool coats to shield them from what they believed was the end of the world. They couldn't see the north side of the rift. They hadn't heard Hokar's final, heartbreaking song over the roar of the horde. To the mountain folk, the skyward explosion of fire and the shattering of the earth meant only one thing: the shadow had won. They waited in terrified silence, braced for the northern nightmare to surge through the smoke and sweep over the ridge to erase their homes forever. The awful, magnificent truth was far grander and far more final than anyone on the ridge could yet fathom. The shadow had not won. The shadow had been taken. The earth itself had opened its ancient jaws and swallowed the northern lands of Aethelgard whole. Where Umbara's dark legions had stood just moments before, there was now only a plunging, endless void. Thousands of years of corrupted history. Everything born of the shadow disappeared with it, and the entity that had orchestrated centuries of suffering was now buried beneath millions of tons of shattered bedrock. And then came the rush of the waters. Far to the north, where the ancient remains of the bridge that bound the northern continent to the south for millennia, the final keystone had collapsed. The narrow causeway, what little had remained of it after the first breaking, shattered completely, falling away into the abyss. With a thunderous, distant roar that shook the very horizon, the freezing tides of the Silver Sea came crashing through the fresh breach. High, foaming walls of dark ocean water poured into the newly carved rift, rushing west with terrifying speed. The sea claimed the gap, washing over the burning blue embers, drowning the smoldering chasms, and filling the void where land used to be. The bridge was gone. The northern land was gone. In a single, earth-shattering act of sacrifice, Hokar had not just fought off an invasion. He had physically severed the world, drowning Umbara's power beneath the freezing depths of a newly born sea. Slowly, the violent churning of the air ground to a halt. The suffocating clouds of soot and ash began to drift southward, thinning out until the vast, empty sky opened up above them once more. The realization hit like a physical weight, settling over the silent battlefield with agonizing clarity. Rian was the first to move. He pushed himself up off his knees, his limbs trembling so roughly he could barely keep his balance. Then Adora stood beside him, her hands trembling, her chest heaving as she stared out into the void. Rian took a slow step forward, then another. He walked to the very spot where his grandfather had stood just moments before, where Hokar had held the living light, where he had sung his final song, and where he had given everything to save them. There was nothing left. Where the tundra had once stretched endlessly into the north, there was now only a staggering, colossal chasm spanning miles across. In the far distant horizon, the pale, jagged peaks of the umbral lands could barely be seen through the misty spray, severed forever from the rest of Aethelgard. Far below the new edge of the continent, the Silver Sea roared. Its freezing, dark waves crashed violently against the sheer face of the newly carved cliffside, churning with white foam as the ocean swallowed the sunken bedrock and filled the gap. Adora walked up beside Rian, stepping right to the precipice. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, gripping him with every ounce of strength she had left. Tears quietly cut clean tracks through the soot on her face. They stood together, utterly distraught, looking out into the vast, empty air. Rian knew, deep in the quiet, hollow space in his chest, he knew his grandfather was gone. Hokar was not coming back. The last pillar of his bloodline, the anchor of his life, was gone. Yet, as the roaring of the newly formed sea settled into a steady, rhythmic cadence against the rocks far below, the silence ahead of them felt almost peaceful. The suffocating, endless dread that had plagued the north for generations was gone. The dark mists were gone. There was only the vast sky, the salt air rising from the waves, and a quiet world trying to breathe again. The air felt warm once again, as if an early summer had just dawned over a bitterly cold winter.